Hello. For the last couple of weeks, I've been working on the upcoming Q&A video as well as kickstarting my 2026 reading. I've already read some really excellent things, a couple of highlights: Kill 6 Billion Demons, the webcomic, wildly imaginative Buddhist sci-fi martial arts action. I kinda regret not checking it out sooner, but at the same time, I have no regrets because it comes out at a pace of like one page every week or two. And so I easily blew through 12 years worth of updates in the span of like a day and a half. Me and my friends just read Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin as part of our book club. I don't know how many original insights I could possibly have for one of the most important queer novels of the 20th century. Have you ever wanted to see how many times one bisexual man can fumble the bag over the course of 150 pages? Well, now you can find out. Apparently, it was originally supposed to get a film adaptation in the 1970s starring Robert De Niro and Marlon Brando. That would have been nuts. Finally, I am in the middle of reading my first big fantasy series of the year, the Riddlemaster trilogy by Patricia McKillop. This is one of the critical darlings of the late 1970s, so obviously entirely up my alley. I'm only one book down. It might be a masterpiece, but I can't tell. The first book is pure mystery box, right? J.J. Abrams style. So that first novel doesn't really work by itself because of all of these mysteries, so it really depends on how these later two books shake out, but Patricia McKillop is a master of her craft, so I trust that it's gonna be really good. So I'm still in the bag. But anyway, yesterday I was feeling a little antsy and I wanted to get out of the house, so I ended up going to some of the local used bookstores and doing a bit of a shopping spree. And then my friend told me, hey, why don't you make a haul video out of that? And I'm like, damn, I guess I should. I feel like for most people who talk about books online, hauls are a bit of a crutch, right? Because it means you just get to buy things and you don't have to put in the hard work of reading them. But since we're getting towards the end of January and I don't really have anything else that's presentable right now, I just figured that I would record this quickly because I found lots of weird and interesting things that I think you would like to hear about. I did a rough count. I think I got 40 books in all. So most of these are stuff that I bought yesterday, but I'm also throwing in a couple of things that I bought off of the internet over the last month. I think I'm gonna start with paperbacks first, and then I'm going to work my way up to heavier and bigger books. So first up, let's talk about our classic Ballantines, The Boats of the Glen Corrig by William Hope Hodgson. William Hope Hodgson is one of the fathers of weird fiction, most known for House in the Borderland, but he also wrote The Nightland. This is his first book. It's like a ghost ship story. You can kind of think of this as Curse of the Obra Dinn in book form. The craziest thing about William Hope Hodgson is he only wrote a handful of books before he was killed at a tragically young age in World War I. He was just on an offensive with the British Army, and then just some German shell came and blew him to smithereens, really. Absolutely gorgeous cover, by the way. But you don't need me to point that out with Ballantines. Kai Lung's Golden Hours by Ernest Brahma. The Kai Lung series, as you can guess, were a set of ancient Chinese historical fantasies from the early 20th century, of which two of them got reprinted by the Ballantine Adult Fantasy line. Kai Lung is kind of what you would think of as a bard archetype. He is a guy who goes around ancient China just telling different stories and using those stories to make money or outwit people and whatnot. I should point out the obvious fact that Ernest Brahma was a white guy, so I think these books are probably a little problematic by modern standards, but I think when looking in the grand scheme of literature, this would have been very progressive for the day. In the 1920s and 30s, when the default characterization of Chinese people in Western media was a whole slew of awful yellow peril stereotypes, having a single book series with an exclusively Chinese cast past that adulates ancient Chinese culture and custom was, you know, very forward thinking for the time. The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. I've read this before. It's really weird to classify it as a fantasy novel. G.K. Chesterton is a Catholic writer and theologian, most known for his Father Brown mysteries, but he is a big influence on C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and Gene Wolfe. You know, a lot of these high church guys with a theological bent to their fantasy writing. But The Man Who Was Thursday doesn't really cleanly classify as a fantasy novel. It's sort of this like surreal satire of leftist politics. This guy gets inducted into this anarchist society where everyone refers to each other by code names that are based off of the days of the week. Long story short, there are so many layers of obfuscation as to who is leading the organization or even like what the organization is trying to do. It's just all these dudes in meetings just bickering and trying to figure out the next course of action. I need to give this a reread sometime. The Water of the Wondrous Isles by William Morris. William Morris, one of the most important artists, craftsmen, socialists, etc. of the late 19th century. It's so crazy that he was influential in so many different fields of like art and culture and politics, and along the way he kind of invents the fantasy novel just as a hobby. George MacDonald was writing earlier than he was, but he is often credited as the first fantasy writer to write in a secondary world, like to make up a fantasy world where everything takes place in. I was checking to see if this book had a map. He is also credited as being the first dude to put maps in his fantasy books, but I don't really see one in here. Even though Morris was writing fantasy for a short amount of time, he was hyper prolific. This is one of 2 full-length novels that he wrote like the year he died. Now that I basically have the full collection of his work, I'm hoping to do a deep dive sooner rather than later, but you know, we'll see. Nif the Lean by Michael Shea. This is a very influential fantasy novel from the early 80s, but it's super hard to find. I think due to some shenanigans with his estate, all of his books are super out of print. I remember one time I was at a used bookstore in Washington State in Seattle, and they had a copy of Nif the Lean, and I was like, oh, nifty. How much is that? And I think the guy said like, oh yeah, it's low price. It's only $300 or something like that. And I was like, ah! So when this popped up on eBay for like 40 bucks, I just nabbed it immediately. Like, these are so rare to find, and even though this copy is a little beat up, you know, it's sun damage, blah 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 blah, I don't care. I just want the book, you know, to read. So I'm just like really happy to have a copy at this at all. I think Michael Shea kind of wrote this book in tribute to Jack Vance. Like, it's sort of written in the same style as The Dying Earth, but it's about this roguish dude who is in hell and going on misadventures. I don't know, but again, I'm very happy to have a copy of this at all. Let's do 2 sci-fi books. 1, The Quantum Thief by Hannu Rajaniemi. I think he's Finnish. I might be wrong. I don't really know anything about this. This is one of the most acclaimed sci-fi novels of the last 20 years, so I thought this would be a nifty thing to have for a rainy day. That's it. Planet of the Apes by Pierre Boulet. This is a slim little novel. If I remember correctly, this has a slightly different but equally impactful twist ending as the movie. If you haven't seen those movies, I just watched the movies for the first time a year or 2 ago. You gotta watch them. They're nutso. I'm talking about the original ones from the 70s, because you know what the first one is. And then the second movie is the first movie, but a lot worse, complete with its own knockoff Charlton Heston. They do some truly bizarre narrative moves in movies 3 through 5. Pierre Boulez is also the guy who wrote Bridge Over the River Kwai, A Lean Night. Here's some standalone-ish fantasy novels. Vonda N. McIntyre's The Moon in the Sun. She won the Hugo, I think, for writing Dream Snake. Dream Snake. But she also wrote The Moon in the Sun, which is a historical fantasy novel about King Louis XVI of France kidnapping a mermaid and then like using her powers to become immortal. This got adapted into a movie by my favorite purveyor of trash cinema, Sean McNamara, the esteemed luminary who created such masterpieces as Three Ninjas, High Noon at Mega Mountains starring Hulk Hogan, Bratz, the movie. In my college dorm room, I had a full-sized poster of Bratz, the movie. That didn't impress any dates, I can tell you that. Baby Geniuses 3, Baby Geniuses 4, Baby Geniuses 5, and Reagan. Even though he had only directed quite literally the worst children's movies ever made, he got like a huge full budget production of this movie, which they retitled to The King's Daughter, starring Fan Bingbing as the mermaid and Pierce Brosnan as King Louis XVI. It was set to come out in the spring of 2015. 2 weeks before the movie was set to come out, they were like, actually, can we take a little bit more time? We aren't done with the CGI yet. It drops off the release calendar. Everyone forgets about it. Everyone except me, who is checking Sean McNamara's Wikipedia article every 3 months. Is The King's Daughter out yet? That movie does not end up getting released until 2022. It took 8 years for that movie to come out. And you know what? I still haven't seen it yet. Maybe it's good. It's probably not, but maybe. War for the Oaks by Emma Bull. This is an iconic and super important romantic urban fantasy of the late 1980s. If it came out today, all the book talk girlies would be eating this up. Seriously, it has all of the right elements. You have our lead girl who is like a punk singer. For whatever reason, she gets sucked into a war between these different fairy courts in modern day urban civilization. And then she is interlocuting with this kind of fairy demon guy who's kind of nefarious, but she has like lots of edgy sexual chemistry with him. I think, maybe, I don't know. I haven't read it. Moonwise by Greer Gilman. This has been on my radar for a while, so I'm glad to finally found it. Greer Gilman hasn't written all that much except for this one novel, but this is often compared to the works of Gene Wolfe and John Crowley for being like simultaneously a very dense but poetically lyrical fantasy novel, but maybe one with more of a feminist tinge. This has a cover illustrated by Thomas Canty, and throughout all of my experience and research, I've come to realize that anytime a novel is illustrated by Thomas Canty, I need to keep saying Thomas as opposed to Tom Canty, because Tom Canty is the kid from Prince and the Pauper. Thomas Canty is the illustrator. Anytime Thomas Canty does the cover, you are in for a banger of 1990s literary fantasy that more often than not has some feminist tinge, right? I am so hyped for this. You wouldn't even believe. The Fallible Fiend by L. Sprague de Camp. L. Sprague de Camp's maybe one of the most prolific writers of mid-20th century fantasy. He did the Harold Shea series with Fletcher Pratt, which I'm going to be reading later this year with some friends. He did the Tritonian Ring, which is right here. Wow, wowie zowie, right there. Part of the Pusadian Chronicles. But this is his other big fantasy world, which was initiated by... Oh wait, do I also have this here? Oh, good golly, Miss Molly. I got it right here. I can't knock Yanni over though. The Goblin Tower by L. Sprague de Camp. So this is like book 1, and I think this is like book 3 or 4. So I'm kind of starting to collect all of them. These books are written in a very interesting time period, late 60s, early 1970s, where the success of Lord of the Rings is driving a lot of writers to write high fantasy for the first time, but this is before the era where Lester Del Rey unlocks the cheat code where you can just literally rip off Lord of the Rings and get away with it, and that happens in 1977. Like 1977 is the year high fantasy almost exclusively becomes Tolkien coded. Stuff that's written beforehand might take slight themes, but are usually their own standalone works, really. From everything I hear, L. Sprague de Camp cooked with this series. This might be his magnum opus, so I'm very excited to get to him eventually. Tross of Samothrace by Talbot Mundy. Talbot Mundy was a pulp adventure writer in the early 20th century, late 19th century. I think it's really easy when we talk about pulp fantasy to just kind of assume that it all started with Robert E. Howard with Conan the Barbarian, but that's not really the case at all. It was really more of a spectrum. Over the past 50 years, pulp writers are writing adventure fiction that slowly takes on more and more fantasy elements over time. You can think of like H. Rider Haggard, right? And Talbot Mundy is in the same vein. He is a guy who is writing historical adventure fiction that ends up being proto sword and sorcery. And as a result, he ends up being maybe one of the most influential writers of the 20th century, because every single major sword and sorcery writer, Robert Howard, Michael Moorcock, Fritz Leiber, all read Talbot Mundy and they cited him as one of their biggest influences. So this is specifically his novel about Tross of Samothrace, who is this Greek guy who sails to England during the Roman Empire, and he helps all the Celts and Druids and whatnot fight against Roman imperialism and fight against Julius Caesar and whatnot. And apparently this was super controversial at the time, that you would take the position that imperialism was bad was super offensive to all the British people who were reading this. They're like, by Jove, how dare he? The sun will never set on the British Empire. Well, guess what, bitch? It did. I'm sorry. Next one takes a little bit of context. I often find myself getting into fights with Google AI, the great Satan. Every time I'm trying to learn information, Google AI will give me information that is confidently incorrect. And I know enough to know that that's not the answer I'm looking for. So it becomes a real stalemate when I get into battle with this digital Jocasta Nu. You remember Jocasta Nu? The single most evil character in all of Star Wars? That old librarian? If a planet is not in the Jedi archives, then it doesn't really exist. And Obi-Wan's like, what if the planet's not in the Jedi archives? And she's like, no, you're wrong. So anyway, that's just me every time I interact with Google search these days. I was trying to remember a novel that I read about. What is that fantasy novel from the early 80s that is often compared by critics to The Hobbit? Specifically, the 1937 novel, The Hobbit. Google is like, you mean the Sword of Shannara? And I'm like, no, I don't mean the Sword of Shannara. The Sword of Shannara came out in 1977. And it's like, well, yeah, but it was popular in the early 80s. So you're thinking of the Sword of Shannara. And I'm like, no, I'm not thinking of the Sword of Shannara. You're lying to me. You're lying to me, you piece of shit. I hate you and I hate everything that AI is doing to this beautiful green world of ours. That may be true, but the answer is still the Sword of Shannara. So here's what I did. I set up some search parameters on Wikipedia and I skimmed through the headings of some 700 articles, seeing if I could find my answer. And guess what? I did. I won. The answer was The Elfin Ship by James Blaylock, published in 1982. A work that was often compared by critics and audiences to The Hobbit, the 1937 novel by J.R.R. Tolkien. Hear that, Google, you piece of shit? Anyway, I bought The Stone Giant, which is the sequel to The Elfin Ship. I don't really have much to say about the novel. It seems to be kind of like light and goofy, and it's elves and dwarves. You know, they have submarines and technology and whatnot. I just have so much hatred for AI. It's unreal. I will beat it every single time with my own human ingenuity. That is a promise. Sorcerer's Son and The Crystal Palace by Phyllis Eisenstein. Phyllis Eisenstein is a fantasy writer who I am getting very, very interested in. I've collected some of her other books as well. I would love to do a deep dive into her. These are the books that I've been avoiding collecting, but I just bit the bullet and got them because these were her books that were most acclaimed. These are 2 books of a trilogy that never got finished, which isn't to say she didn't write the 3rd book. She wrote the 3rd book, but 6 months before it was meant to come out, her publisher went out of business back in 2007. She passed away before she ever got to release that final book. It's just sitting in a vault somewhere, and I want it to come out. Maybe this is just a loose trilogy, like these books share characters and they'll be fine read standalone, but the fact that there is this seemingly permanently missing 3rd part deeply bothers me, and I really hope that we can unlock it someday. Erewhon by Samuel Butler. This is a utopian novel from the 1870s that satirized Victorian society. Very important 19th century fantasy predecessor. Ooh, and this is the larger type for easy reading as well. Wow, look how easily you can read that. Okay, this is a crazy one. A Princess in Romania by Paul Park. This is a book that has been recommended to me before, and this is a book that has a massive fan base amongst literary fantasy authors. We have the pull quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, Michael Swanwick, and John Crowley also singing its praises. All of the men and women who have the most interesting themes and prose in fantasy all love this book. But there is something weird about it. On Goodreads, its score is 2.8. I don't put that much stock in Goodreads reviews. Every single one of the books that I think are the worst to ever be written by humans ever often have like pretty high scores, and a lot of my favorites have lower scores than that. But all in all, Goodreads is a very positive platform. 50 Shades of Grey will have like a 3.67. 67! I didn't mean to do that. I'm sorry. I don't even know what it means, man. I'm so old. Books that are pretty widely reviled will get like a 3.5 or a 3.4 or a 3.3. Once again, this is at a 2.8. That is lower than Mein Kampf. Like, seriously. That is what makes me so curious about this novel. Just what about it makes it so reviled by mainstream audiences that it genuinely has one of the lowest possible scores in all of fantasy literature? I bet it's good. Next up is The Hawkswood Voyage by Paul Kearney. This is the first of the Monarchies of God series, a set of 5 books that he wrote in the late 90s and early 2000s. I only learned about this recently, but what makes it so interesting, it came out at the exact same time as the early George R.R. Martin Ice and Fire books. And it deals with many of the same themes. You know, it's this pitch black, super bleak war chronicle. This is apparently a favorite series of Steven Erikson, and it was a huge influence on Malazan Book of the Fallen. So the question is, this is a highly esteemed novel that shares so much thematic ground with Ice and Fire as well as Malazan. So why are those 2 series hyper popular while this one languishes in obscurity? I don't know, but I'm gonna find out. Even though this is like a huge sweeping fantasy epic, all of the books books are on average 300 pages long. They're super short. And the fact that Paul Kearney evidently knows how to get to the point while writing also makes me very interested in him. This is only the first novel. I need to find 4 more before I can really do my deep dive. Christine de Pizan, The Treasure of the City of Ladies. She was a woman who was writing in the early 1400s in the French court, and this is her treatise about a hypothetical city where all of the women who ever lived kind of cohabitate. Pagan goddesses as well as Christian saints. What if you had a community entirely of women? It's kind of reminiscent of The Dinner Table, famous art installation by what's-her-face. I'm sorry, I don't remember her name. I had literally never heard of Christine de Pizan before I picked up this book. I literally just bought this because of the vibes. I see an old Penguin classic with some woman writing on the cover, and I'm like, it's probably going to be a hood classic. This seems like it might be very useful for my upcoming video in February. Wink. Darker Than You Think by Jack Williamson. This one is crazy. I'm gonna ask you a question. When was this written? I'm gonna let you take a good gander at it. Take a good gander at this goth lady with hyper oily cleavage. Do you have your answer? That's right, 1946. This is a horror novel from the 40s that they just gave a slick coat of paint to so that they could sell it to mall goths in 1992. And I guess it worked, because this is the edition that I found. I think this is a book about hot werewolves. Maybe this would also be popular with the Book Talk girlies if it got released today, huh? The Stone in the Flute by Hans Bemann. This is one of the great works of 1980s German fantasy. I think when we talk about German fantasy, most of what gets ported over is the stuff for children. Obviously, Neverending Story, all the works of Cornelia Funke, like Dragon Rider and Inkheart. I grew up reading those. The Walter Moore's books, which I really want to get more into. I think this is a full fairy tale epic that was written for adults in 1987, and it is thick. I didn't expect it to be this thick. But if this is like a whole epic, which is 1 volume, then the thickness will be worth it. Fire from Heaven. This was in the buy this for $2 section to take it off our hands. I'm not familiar with Michel Bataille. He is evidently a popular French writer of the early 20th century. But what caught my eye is a novel about Gilles de Rais. If you don't know him, Gilles de Rais is maybe the single most evil man who's ever lived. I don't even really recommend looking up what he did. It's gonna ruin not just your entire week, like your entire year. How do you write a novel about the most irredeemably evil person who ever lived? This Frenchman knows. Vacuum Flowers by Michael Swanwick. I've talked very highly of Michael Swanwick before. It's kind of an early cyberpunk. This was a time period when he did a couple of collaborations with William Gibson of Neuromancer fame. This seems like it's pretty rare compared to his later works. The Silver Metal Lover by Tanith Lee. I am currently reading a Tanith Lee novel, and it's great. It's not the one you're thinking of. I'd be surprised if anyone could guess the one that I am reading right now. This is another one of her beloved novels. This is like a romantic sci-fi novel. It's exactly what it says on the tin, The Silver Metal Lover. Ladies, what if you had a robot boyfriend who was really good at playing the guitar? Would you love him even though he's a robot? This is a book that was popular throughout the entirety of Tanith Lee's career, so it was printed often, and many of those covers are terrible. The fact that I found a version of this book that has a pretty lovely painted cover is why I decided to pick it up when I did. We got 2 queer feminist classics. The first is Journey to Zelindar, The Personal Account of Sair of Samasi by Diana Rivers. Diana Rivers was a very important queer feminist of the late 20th century. I guess she did a lot of organizing, helped pioneer the idea of women-only communes, women-only spaces, etc., etc. And she wrote a couple of fantasy novels that are just sort of expounding on that idea. This is the story of a girl who is mistreated by men, mistreated by the world, and she kind of finds community and healing in a society of horse lesbians. They are lesbians who ride horses. They aren't lesbians who are horses. Does that make sense? The other is Privilege of the Sword by Ellen Kushner. Ellen Kushner and her wife Delia Sherman are increasingly on my radar for writing some of the best early 90s literary fantasy, but despite their influence, they didn't actually write all that much. This is the final member of a loose trilogy that Ellen Kushner wrote, the first being Swords Point. All three of them are early fantasy of manners, which I mentioned in my last video. They're exploring queer themes and women's place in society and so forth, using more of a emotionally intelligent form of narrative that's more about relationships and compassion as opposed to just brute force, right? But there is lots of swords in it. I mean, it's called The Privilege of the Sword. This dame has a sword. Here's 4 in one go. As my Christmas present to myself last month, I bought the entirety of Egypt by John Crowley, The Solitudes, Love and Sleep, Daemonomania, and Endless Things. This is John Crowley's magnum opus. I love Little Big, and this is what he spent the 20 years after Little Big working on. So the entire middle period of his career is just making these 4 books, which are kind of like this modern day low fantasy epic that ties into the lengthy history of the occult. John Dee or whoever makes a huge appearance, or maybe not. I haven't read these books, but the problem is every time he published one of these books, it would often be from a different publisher than from whoever published the previous one, right? And so the only time the entire series was ever printed in the same edition was the 2007 Overlook Press version. The Overlook Press, from whom you can buy the ebook for the Mabinogion tetralogy by Evangeline Walton. Fun fact. These books are mad out of print. Half of them aren't even listed on their website. I felt like I was arguing with Jocasta New saying, hey, I want Endless Things by the Overlook Press. And the internet is like, that book never existed. No one ever made such a book. Well, guess what? I am holding it in my hand. So clearly someone did. No matter how many sketchy eBay sellers I had to sort through in order to prove that correct. I'm hoping that my effort is worth it. I'm just like so glad to have this all in one place because I don't really see these getting reprinted anytime soon. Walpurgisnacht by Gustav Meyrink. Gustav Meyrink is a early 20th century Austrian weird fiction writer. He is most famous for writing The Golem. He wasn't Jewish, but he used a lot of Jewish themes and cultural motifs in his writing. So as you can guess, all of his writing was banned by the Nazi Party. I think The Golem is generally considered to be the best work of German weird fiction ever published. I'm still looking for The Golem, but in the meantime, I found Walpurgisnacht. It was written in 1917, this surreal horror novel taking place in Prague in the middle of the First World War. Look at this little gremlin guy. I don't think this novel is going to be a happy time for anyone involved. Earlier this year, I read Imaginary Worlds by Lynn Carter, which is often credited as the first ever nonfiction book that provided a general overview of fantasy. That gave me a bug to try to fill out my library with other nonfiction about fantasy. The first of these is Strategies of Fantasy by Brian Atterbury. I read a bit of it. This was a really important text when it came out in 1992 or whatever, but it didn't end up really being what I was looking for. It's more of a philosophy book of critical literary theory that just happens to utilize fantasy to explore feminism and postmodernism and all these other things, rather than an actual like history of the genre itself. Next up is The Evolution of Modern Fantasy by Jamie Williamson. This is more of a contemporary book in which Jamie Williamson kind of argues that the modern canon of fantasy is entirely shaped by the Ballantine adult fantasy line. And as someone who glazes Ballantines, I think I'm going to agree with his historiography iconography, right? Once the Lynn Carter book has faded from my head a little bit, I'm gonna try reading this so that I'm not just reading all the same information twice in a row. Finally, we have Rhetorics of Fantasy by Farah Mendlesohn. This came out in the mid-2000s, 2006 maybe. This is a hyper-influential book about how we discuss fantasy. In this book, she proposes a taxonomy of how we sort different fantasy novels. So she's the one who's saying like, hey, this is a portal fantasy. This is a liminal fantasy. This is an intrusion fantasy. All these terms that get utilized today. But at the same time, I think she will be the first to admit that her taxonomy is by no means conclusive. The entire 5th chapter of this is her just listing all the different books that she couldn't figure out how to fit into her other sections. It really bothers me when people will confidently tell you what counts as portal fantasy and what doesn't count as portal fantasy based entirely off of vibes, when there is a very real book that anyone could just read and find out what the answer is. Instead, everyone's just kind of using Google AI and Wikipedia definitions. No one's going back to the source, and that bothers me a lot. So I want to be the person who goes back to the source. I want to read this and then have it as a toolbox to allow me to articulate stuff going forward. The King Must Die and the Bull from the Sea by Mary Renault. This is Mary Renault's popular historical fantasy / mythology duology about the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. I've been meaning to read this for a year now, and I still haven't gotten around to it, and maybe the fact that I picked up this nice combination hardcover will motivate me to finally getting around to reading some Mary Renault, because I know I'll really like her. I just haven't done it yet. Similarly, just last week, my friend gave me a copy of the Elric Saga Part 2 by Michael Moorcock, because I've read the first couple of Elric books. I need to get around to the later ones, so this is really convenient. I really liked Elric of Melnibone, but I got annoyed with the later books very fast because Michael Moorcock is writing all of them out of order, so they can shift violently between their style and tone because he's writing them years or decades apart. Also, he keeps including MCU style references to all of his other book series. Ooh, I just referenced Coram. I just referenced Von Beck. Isn't that so cool? And I'm like, no, I don't know who these guys are. I'm reading this because this is supposed to be your introductory series. I feel locked out of the Michael Moorcock lore legendarium because he keeps rewriting his earlier stories to include references to stories that he hadn't yet written at the time that these were published. Does that make sense? But I should at least get around to reading Stormbringer. Arthur Rackham, Masterpieces of Art. Coffee table book, one of the great fantasy illustrators. Just look at all this, all these goddesses and gremlins. So much of our visual iconography about different myths and fairy tales comes from Arthur Rackham, but I haven't digested enough Arthur Rackham to speak authoritatively about that, and so I'm hoping that this will give me a chance to. Good Fairies by Brian Froud and Bad Fairies by Brian Froud. Yes, this is a double-sided book. Brian Froud, one of the most iconic fantasy illustrators of the 1970s and 80s. You probably know him best for doing all the character designs for the Jim Henson fantasy films, so The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. He wrote his original famous fairy art book in 1979. This is actually the sequel that was illustrated 2 decades later. I don't know this for certain, but I always think of him as being the one responsible for inventing the aesthetic of those horny fairy statuettes that your stepmom always buys. It's actually been hard for me to find stuff from this book to show you because it's literally all too horny. YouTube would not like it one bit. This guy's aesthetic is so important for understanding where fantasy is now, so I really want to digest it some more. Best books for absolute last. Walt Disney's Annette in the Desert in Mystery. Walt Disney's Annette Mystery at Medicine Wheel. I have this weird fascination with the 1950s Disney star Annette Funicello. I grew up watching all of her movies because my mom was obsessed with her. And so now I'm obsessed with Annette Funicello's filmography and, even more importantly, musical career. Imagine me, if you will, on a date. It's going pretty well, but towards the end she asks, "What kind of music do you listen to?" And I panic. I'm like, "Well, I really like Italianette, the 1962 novelty album by Annette Funicello, where she sings the classics of Italy." And she's like, okay. And let's just say there wasn't another date. But can you blame me? She just had so many great songs over such a limited amount of time. And even though she wasn't the strongest singer, she always brought this effervescent charm to her music. Singles like "Oh Dio Mio" and "Tall Paul" and "Dancinette" and "The Monkey's Uncle," which she sung with the Beach Boys at the height of their fame. And who could possibly forget "Pineapple Princess"? He calls me Pineapple Princess all day when he plays the ukulele on the hill above the bay. Pineapple Princess, I love you, you're the sweetest girl I've seen. Someday we're gonna marry and you'll be my pineapple queen. I saw a boy on Oahu Isle strolling down the banks on a crocodile. Anyway, yeah, that's it. I just wanted to sing Pineapple Princess. Bye.